Well, what are the MDG 1 targets? I think we're probably most familiar with the first one. It's the headline one. Halve between 1990 and 2015 the proportion of people whose income is less than $1 a day. This is eradicate extreme poverty. Well, it's not eradicate, of course, it's reduce it. It's reduce it in proportional terms. And this, I think, is the headline that most people are familiar under the MDGs. There are two others. Terry mentioned one of them as a relatively recent indicator, which is related to full and productive employment and work for all, including women and young people. And then the third one, which is perhaps always very important, but particularly in the news in recent months, is halving the number of people, the proportion of people who suffer from hunger. Just putting poverty as an income level by itself poses all sorts of questions. Poverty is much more, of course, than just income. There are all sorts of questions about inequality and relationships. There are all sorts of questions about access to services. There are questions about positions in community. There are questions about wealth, vulnerability. And those are abstracted from in a very simple $1 a day measure. And it is an arbitrary line. What's the difference between being poor and very poor? What's the difference between poverty and ultra-poverty? And a line has to be drawn somewhere. Expenditure poverty requires you to consider how do you actually value $1 in different countries? What is its purchasing power? And recent readjustment of purchasing power parity prices and putting that into $1 a day expenditure poverty counts actually increases the number of people in poverty by 40%. So it's not just a minor issue. It's pretty fundamental. You go up from 1 billion to 1.4 billion. It's a huge change. Now, it may not change the trends that much because you have the same consideration stretching back to 1990, but in absolute terms, it's of course very important. We also have questions, well, should we be looking at proportions or should we be looking at numbers of people? I think there's a very strong case that we should be thinking about numbers. And with world population growth, achievements in proportions may be quite different from achievements in numbers. So you can immediately see there's all sorts of questions about, well, is it a good thing to have a high proportion of working age people in full employment? Actually, if you look at developed and developing countries, you find that in some cases developed countries have a lower proportion because people are not so poor that they all have to work. The aim is to halve the proportion of people suffering from hunger. Again, how do we define suffering from hunger? One way of looking at it is to look at undernourishment rates, and so you can have surveys of underweight children looking at stunting and wasting, and that looks at nutritional outcomes, which are extremely important. Doesn't actually, but those are not dependent solely on access to food. There are lots of other factors which affect that. Access to food doesn't tell the whole story about hunger and food security. We can try to look at consumption of food, and the FAO have a measure of the proportion of the population below the minimum level of dietary energy consumption. And there are significant problems there in terms of how do you define the minimum level of dietary energy consumption. You then work out the total availability of food and then have some sort of distribution of total consumption of food and look at the distribution of that within the population, but that's pretty difficult to work out. So lots of questions in there. The result is that there isn't an agreed figure for the number of hungry. Right, let's move on to achievements or progress. The main one, halving the proportion of people in extreme poverty. And we'll use the $1.25 a day, that's after adjustment for purchasing power parity prices. And globally, we have that from 1990 down to 2000, up to 2005, a fall from 41.7% down to 25.7%. If you extrapolate that on to 2015, we're on track. But that, of course, hides a huge number of issues. And I've highlighted these, and I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about them in terms of, well, what about the numbers of people? What about different regions? What about food prices and other challenges that are coming up? There are questions about urban poverty, questions about data, and also the depth of poverty. So let's look at, first of all, a graph. This shows the numbers of people. And it immediately begins to contradict, if you like, the apparent halving of poverty in the first target. Because we've got population growth, the actual numbers are falling much less fast than the proportion would suggest. But this shows the broad picture that in terms of numbers, and even more so in terms of proportion, East Asia and the Pacific have fallen dramatically and are falling dramatically. Sub-Saharan Africa, we have an increase in numbers, and South Asia, it's just about constant in terms of numbers. So if we look at that here in terms of proportions, we can see that Sub-Saharan Africa has achieved some fall in proportion, but it's very slow. And we've actually got that increase, about an extra 100 million people. These are big numbers. And globally, they are achievable. When you break it down by regions, Africa has no chance, really, of achieving them. And this is a point made, I think, by Easterly, that Africa is, if you like, you could argue, it's discriminated against in the construction of these. It is no hope for Africa to achieve the MDGs from the way that they've been constructed on a global level. Challenges, if you like. Food prices, it's estimated that 100 million extra people may be pushed into poverty as a result of higher food prices. Gordon Conway has talked about a perfect storm of crises coming at us in the last few months, with a credit crunch, recession, climate change, food prices interacting, but actually with different routes. And how can the state respond to those? How can it deal with the competing demands of different interest groups? And how can it manage transitions which provides stability, flexibility, efficiency, and also probity?